So, Warren, what's been your experience with SRE?
That's quite the way of just jumping into the episode. And I was so unprepared because I'm not even the guest for today's episode. So I don't have an answer to that question, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. Jillian, what about your thoughts on SRE? You're a contract, not just a contractor. You're a contractor. You just light stuff on fire, and then if they want to put out, you bill them for it, right?
I mean, really, like I just need to make sure data doesn't get deleted because that's like a problem. That is a problem, okay? And that's really all that I worry about in terms
Or
of
it's a
any kind
security
of
feature
reliability.
because you can't be exploited if there's no data left.
I mean, that's true.
I will say that there is a book out there published by one of the hyperscalers, I believe, that attempts to define it in their own terms. But I feel like a lot of things they do, it's used as a introduction into the topic rather than used as experts. So I'm really interested to hear what our guest today will be sharing with us.
Well, yeah, which is a great segue because clearly we need some expert opinions on SRE. And so we've got Aimee Knight with us. Aimee, welcome to the show.
Hey, happy to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to SRE.
Sure. Yeah, I love SRE. It's a little bit of a love-hate relationship. It can be very stressful at times, but I also love it. I feel like it is kind of when I and this I'll get into kind of like my path into SRE and it really suits I feel like my engineering brain perfectly. And the high level there is I come from non-traditional background, so self-taught, did the whole boot camp thing 12 years ago now, which is insane to me. I'm really old or feel really old. Um, like I saw someone on Twitter the other day talk about like what did you use before Git? And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm really old now because my first job we used Mercurial, which I guess is Git, but at the same time, like it yeah, so um, but anyways, so backing up, and I used to do JavaScript Jabber, so I kind of started off in JavaScript land, did Node and all the front end. I kind of focused heavily on front end for a little while, did Node as well, um, and then I think it was like 2018, 2019. I went to work at NPM, which was like my dream job at the time, until they got acquired. And, it was just a little bit of a bummer because it was very short lived. But when I was there, we did cross functional teams. And my manager at the time was like, you seem really interested in like this platform, SRE work, infrastructure. We can probably hire for a web developer more easily than we can hire for that role. Do you want to go over to that team? And I was like, yes, sign me up. Like you want to, if I have the opportunity to learn a new skill on the job, like yes. So I did SRE at NPM for a while. And then I did most of my SRE work at Paramount Global, which is like the streaming application, and did two Super Bowls there.
Oh,
The
wow.
the last year's Super Bowl. And so that's kind of my journey into SRE, and why I say it is like I feel like SRE is really like my perfect niche in engineering, and that is because coming from this non-traditional background, I've always been the programmer who is like, sure, that new tech is really fun and interesting, but like, shouldn't that be something we're working on like on the weekends on our own time? Like, isn't our job like I hate saying this because people hate me, but end of the day, like I'm just like I feel very fortunate to have a career in tech, and in the back of my mind, I'm always like, my job, whether I like it or not, like if I'm working hours, my job is to make this company profitable. um, and while I love programming for fun on my own, like I have a responsibility to the business to make the business profitable, keep it alive. I've worked in a lot of startups, so I understand this. And that's where SRE really fits in because it's like a lot of roles, yes, you're accountable to the business, but I feel like in an SRE role, through we can get into like SLAs, SLIs, SLOs, but the SLAs, like you are accountable to the business stakeholders, and that is your overarching goal. So basically, in a nutshell, SRE, site reliability engineering. I also call it like production readiness engineering. It is your task to keep the application running optimally for as much uptime as possible.
So what I heard was that you at NPM had so much work and we're doing such a great job that they're like, here's more work. Be responsible for the success of the business and not just solving tickets and pushing out features.
No, but honestly, truly, like my manager there, he was absolutely amazing, as were a lot of the people that I worked with, like absolutely brilliant, talented people. And I don't know, I'm like distributed systems nerd. Like on the weekends, I like to watch YouTube videos of distributed systems interviews. Like I don't know why this is very interesting to me. But I've always like just gravitated towards that sort of thing. So.
You don't have to shame yourself for that. I think lots of us on the weekend, yeah, we're watching interviews and other tech things. Yeah, for sure.
Whenever there's like a big outage of like a big tech company, I'm always like reading the postmortems and trying to talk about them with my husband. And he's just like, he tries to act interested, but he's just like,
Good for
what's
him.
wrong? He's like, I love how nerdy you are. I'm like, okay, I'll just talk to myself then.
You got to really, I think that's a super interesting point where you talked about you were working on JavaScript development, and then you went over to SRE. And I think that's a really important skill to have for that, because like as the SRE, like it's not just about the infrastructure or the Datadog metrics or whatever. Like a lot of times you've got to dig into the code and discover like what's actually going on here. And so how do you feel like those web development skills set you up for success as an SRE?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a common question I get from people who are also interested in SRE because, and I also feel like, you know, backing up a little bit, SRE, I know Warren mentioned like the Google SRE book, but I also feel like this focus on SRE really came about via microservices, buzzword. I hate saying them, but it is what it is. But so to kind of answer your question there, I feel like the teams that I've been on, not necessarily NPM, but Paramount specifically, they had a lot of like systems engineers. Like the team was very system engineer heavy. So a lot of these people who like worked in data centers, and those are all obviously very valuable skills as an SRE. But where they were really lacking was like the programming side of things, application development side of things. And I feel like to have a really good SRE team, you do need a mixture of both. And you can really like learn from each other. So in the SRE, like in SRE roles that I've been in, I am doing some programming. You need to be able to debug the program. You're also doing some programming in you're doing like scripting. A lot of SRE, I don't think people realize, is a lot of like caching at the edge. And so you're doing a lot of custom logic that gets deployed to your CDNs and things like that. So while it might not be as intensive as like building out a feature and stuff like that, you still need those programming concepts to write that kind of code, and then also to work with the developers because, for better or worse, there is like that's the telltale like thing that people say about SRE is like that push and pull between the engineering department because they have a vested interest in getting their stuff out to production, and then SRE has a vested interest in keeping the system healthy and functioning.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you did mention that it can be different in different places. So like from your experience, what has being an SRE really meant? Like, is there a standard day? And I know that's a terrible question for asking, any sort of engineer or technical person. But some expectations around what the role is that you were doing both at NPM and Paramount.
Yeah, so NPM obviously it was a relatively small team. We had the SRE team. And there was a lot of, like I said, it was cross-functional. So we were tasked with building out features, but the team was like a cross-functional team where we had a platform engineer, we had an SRE infrastructure engineer, we had a application developer, and all working together to get something out to production. And like the SRE side of things there would be, like I was saying, I talk about SRE in terms of like production readiness. So making sure that this feature is ready for production. If there are like dashboards that need to be made, making sure that those are in place so that we can properly monitor when it goes to production, making sure that you have the proper resources for the machines that it's going to be running on, things like that. At Paramount, that's a much larger NPM has a very large scale, but it was extremely bursty. And when I say like extremely bursty, like the traffic would spike, but it would be very short-lived. At Paramount, similar, but not quite to that extent. Like bursty as in like you're going to see a high rush of traffic when a large event kicks off. It'll stay relatively high, but it kind of like starts to taper off as the events go down and things like that. But Paramount SRE, like a larger SRE teams, it's usually segmented into different departments. So you have like an infrastructure focused department. You would have like a DevSecOps because there's a lot of security that goes into SRE. And you would have like an observability monitoring team. I feel like observability and monitoring is where you hear a lot of like focus on SRE.
For sure.
But it is definitely like segmented into different teams, and it is very different at different places.
So you spend all your time looking at graphs. That's what I.
When I was more on the infrastructure side of things, but yes, like we work heavily with like the observability team to make sure that the dashboards are in place and they have the data that you need and everything's hooked up properly.
That sounds like the go-between, like when get the application metrics into some place that a different team owns. And then when that team exposes a problem, you're then have to ferry that back to the application team to tell them about the issue that they caused in production.
Yeah, and that's where like what Forrest was saying, it's complicated. Uh-oh, what?
So Will and I had a little joke going on before the stream started.
We forgot to end the joke.
And the joke basically ended where I decided to change his moniker in the stream that Aimee only you can stream. Only you can see. No one else, like none of the audience will be able to see this.
Will, it's Will. I'm so sorry.
No, it's hilarious. It's great because
you got
well played, Warren. Well played.
You got me. You look like a forest. You look like a forest. But
well, that was how the joke started, is because like Warren was asking me something and I was like, dude, I don't know. I just feel like Forrest Gump because I just wander around places in my life and great shit happens. And then people are like, how'd you do that? I'm like, I don't know. I was just standing there.
Okay, Will, I'm so sorry. I feel terrible now. You got me good. Thank you. And now I've lost my train of thought a little bit.
Oh,
but
me too. It's completely gone.
I think what I was about to say is like there's a fine line because obviously it doesn't make sense for the SRE to be the person that debugs the code. But in a perfect scenario, ultimately, like the sort of thing that probably should happen is SRE is usually like, sometimes you'll have like a knock team who's kind of like the first line of defense that does like a smoke test. Like, okay, we got an alert, we got paged. Is the application, can I reach it? Like, can I just go to my browser and reach it? Like, is it up? Is it hard down or is latency, starting to go down, that sort of thing. And the knock team is usually the first line of defense there. If the knock team deems it like, okay, something is awry here, then they'll usually page the SRE team. So SRE team kind of, usually you'll have like playbooks in place to do like a sanity check of like jump on one of the Kubernetes pods, kind of see what's going on. Are these pods erroring? Something like that. But ultimately what should happen is there should, in my opinion anyways, like a close relationship with SRE and the development team that it's clear like we have an environment in this microservices system where we can do a safe rollback. And so what typically would happen, at least in my opinion, my role, like I would deem like, okay, and I have a rough understanding of like what the feature is, what's the impact, because there could be a business impact of rolling back. Ultimately, we want to make that would, when I say business impact, like you have some sort of like feature for Black Friday and it's peak traffic and this feature is like driving revenue, so there's like a, but it's also like causing issues for customers, so you need to kind of make the decision, and this is where the stress gets high of like what's the financial trade-off ultimately here, like to this business person, like because it honestly, like it will bubble all the way up like through the organization to like the CEO of the company, and you need to make the decision of like what's the lesser of the financial impacts here. But long-winded answer, like SRE should have confidence from the engineering team that it's safe to roll back and do like an instant rollback. And it's also then helpful as an SRE if, like, let's say a lot of times you will get paged in the middle of the night. And it's a large organization, and sometimes you have great engineers on your team who you can escalate to, and they usually have like a paging rotation also. But a lot of times, I'm not gonna lie, I was on an SRE team and it's the middle of the night and I page, I'm looking at this pod that's crashing, and I can see that it's like actually like an error in the code, and I page the engineering team and no
Crickets.
crickets.
Just like a group project. Like it's the same.
I page again in 20 minutes and crickets. So I've been in a state where like I'm just rolling pods all night. When I say rolling pods, like restarting pods over and over and over again until someone wakes up in the morning.
Wow. Wait, so when you say NOC, like Network Operations Center, is that
Yeah.
mostly to manage the physical hardware?
Yeah. It's hard for me to say. I didn't work, they were kind of like our first line of defense at some of my jobs. I didn't work super closely with them. But yeah, those were typically the people that were like the hard, like they were working in the data center. And, the organization obviously sees like value and kind of transitioning them to different roles and things like that. So yeah.
So you then have to look at a lot of application specific metrics, so more on the software validation side, and then be that ferry, that bridge back from, okay, there's a problem at the hardware level that's getting escalated, and having to find the application team. And of course, they have no on-call rotation ever because they're not accountable for keeping the systems up and running.
Right? Their job's to ship code.
Yeah, just ship it and hand it over, But that's where, close relationship also, and like I'm saying, like I keep going back to this like production readiness. It should be that before the application team hands over something, like you're saying, like work with the SRE team in advance to make sure that if it's a mission critical service in your microservice architecture, like that the dashboards are in place, you understand the dependencies. When I say dependencies too, like a lot of things that come up in SRE, and that's why like is just, like I say, I nerd out on distributed system stuff. You can see one application starting to show some latency, but the actual impact is more so like a service downstream. And there are different ways of like understanding, obviously, like if this part of the system is having this percentage of latency, then I need to understand that these downstream services are getting hit by this other service X number of times. It's going to start like having this kind of latency. So you really have to understand like the entire system and understand those dependencies. That's where it helps. Like that's where SRE really comes in, because when like these application teams are kind of like siloed, working on their specific service, the SRE team is more responsible for understanding like the trace of a request through the system and understanding those downstream effects.
Wow. I mean, you just got into some really deep topics there. Like there's a huge complexity with like queuing theory and window-based, backoffs there, as well as like the system effect, like actual systems thinking of how one thing triggers another thing, which triggers another thing. And I don't remember ever seeing a boot camp that would have gone anyone prepared for handling this. And you got through this. And now if I understand, you were still like being on the spot to actually make a business impactful decision for the
Yeah.
organization.
Yes, that's where it gets very stressful. And that's where I feel like in this kind of role, you really need someone who cares. And yes, because otherwise the company's revenue is on the line, whether that be not even like I was saying in the example of like the Black Friday issue where like you have to make the call of, is this shopping cart feature more important than the fact that X number of other users can't do this other thing that they need to do, versus even understanding like the SLAs and is there like a financial obligation that I need to pay my customers if X number of things start to go down.
So did you have like some sort of dashboard that listed out every single feature and like how much it was supposed to make for the company and like how much the shopping? I mean, I feel like NPM and Paramount are a little bit weird because it's not really like end user shopping cart scenarios. I mean, I don't really understand Paramount's end user pricing model. I know there's like Plus, right? But other than that, so I feel like it's even harder to really understand what the long-term impact is for each one of those things that's breaking.
It's very different, obviously, at different places. Like, so I keep going back to the shopping cart example. Like, I worked at different startups in like the retail industry, and although I wasn't on the SRE team there specifically, I was more in like an architectural role. So like, kind of tasked with understanding that and working with the DevOps team. But yeah, like in a perfect world, you would have dashboards to help you make those decisions, but you don't have that. So you have to make the best call based on your understanding, and escalate to the right people if you can. And that's where I should really get into, is maybe like shift the conversation too to like strategies besides just like reactive strategies. Because we've talked about like a lot of like reactive approaches to things, but part of what SRE is tasked with is like, how do we make this system more resilient by nature of things we can do?
And I feel like you're in the perfect position to think about and sort of ideate on that. But don't you end up with like a lot of pushback because that's sort of like a shift left approach in the organization where it's like, oh, application product teams, this thing that you're doing that has like a high likelihood that there's going to be a production impact. Maybe you should do something different. How do you get that actually across to those teams so they can like start making those actual changes? Because it's like a mindset or a culture shift for them.
Kind of where I'm going with this is more so on like the redundancy side of things, like SRE team making the decision, and you have to work with like the engineering management leadership to understand like if we're running in like a Kubernetes environment, making that, do we do multi-cloud, we do multi-region, those sorts of decisions. And then that's where I get into I don't think a lot of people necessarily realize, like I was saying, how valuable like content delivery is in this. Because just by nature of having as much as you can cached and distributed outside of like before the request even gets to whether it's like your physical data center or a cloud, how can we like offload some of that traffic? Because I feel like a lot of these systems are just the fall over without that. And I know we mentioned it like at the beginning of the episode, and maybe I'll like touch on it more at the end, but one thing that's been very interesting for me to like sit back and watch is like Gen AI is I hate saying that word but it is what it is, like twofold. First off, like my heart goes out to other SREs who work in environments where they have like developers that are just whatever, this whole vibe coding thing. Like, I don't think people realize how much like these LLMs are hallucinating and producing like content that is just garbage, absolute garbage.
So pour one out for the SRE supporting vibe coding is what you're saying.
Yeah.
We did have some previous guests on the show who were like swearing to us that their LLMs didn't ever hallucinate.
I literally was like, I think I won't say the LM because I'm gonna get myself in trouble. But I was like asking, like going back and forth with one of them earlier this week, like writing stuff, and I asked it to revise it, and it started like putting all these like statistics in, and I was like, I was using a product that allowed me to incorporate a lot of like basically like a RAG GUI. So I could incorporate like a bunch of external sources, and I was like, there's no way those statistics are in those sources. Like, because I know the data that I added. And I asked it, like, where did you get these statistics? And it's like, you're right, I made them up. I'm sorry.
At least you got a conclusive answer there because we're seeing this a lot more with SEO to articles today, where not only are they being generated by LLMs, but the links that they go to do not back up whatever is in the article. And like, so even if a human is writing it, it's just some fluff piece. And if you go there, it's like, oh, 60% of attacks are from this particular source. Like email is the source of all attacks and security isn't. And you go and you click on the link and it's just some completely made up garbage that's also not researched by some other company that had nothing to do with the topic whatsoever. So can you blame the probabilistic, statistical engine that's just predicting the next word that is also going to pull out links that have nothing to do with the topic whatsoever?
Yes. Yeah, you can't blame it, but it's like it's on us to vet it. But what I wanted to touch on that very briefly was just basically like I read something this morning, like the percentage, like there's a direct correlation between these companies that are allowing like more AI assistive like developer stuff, and outages. So my heart, I'd have to like, I think I screenshotted it on LinkedIn, but there was like, it was a lot and it's just in the back of my mind. So there's that side of things. And then there's also just like these like, OpenAI and all these companies like pushing out. It's like a race to get stuff out to production faster. And there's like, I think last year, just the number of outages, like every time I would go to ChatGPT, I think for like almost like a week, I was like half the time it was down. So.
I think the jury is really out on the numbers. I think we've concluded two things, and whether or not people are willing to listen to those is a separate topic. You are trading quality for speed. That is the trade-off. And so, I think there were a bunch of good articles recently by people who work at some of these. You say you don't like the word Gen AI. I really hate the word agentic. That's mine. Companies that they themselves are not using their own LLM to produce the code, right? And so, I see these CEOs say, oh yeah, stand up and be like, oh, our company, like 25% of all the source code we write is by, some sort of LLM. And I'm like, what are you going to do about that risk? You're going to decrease that in the future.
Yeah, I should say, like, I'm not opposed to these tools, but they need to be used responsibly. And for better or worse, like humans, like it's our nature. Like that's what like the famous like programming quote, like we're lazy, like a lazy person makes a good programmer, because they want to automate things. So like there's a lot of value in these tools, but you hands down need to use them responsibly and be able to use them like with actual knowledge behind it. Like I mentor a lot of developers and like for, they're wanting to get stuff done. And I'll see like this code that they wrote and I'm like, that I know where you got that from. That's not right. I don't know why it's telling you to like install Python packages in your Node application, but this is not right. No, yeah. Anyways, yeah.
But on a side note, I'm really admired that you got those Python packages to work inside of Node.js. So
Well, it just comes with a foreign function interface, and you just shell out to that. No big deal. And your application, it's just multiple programming language. What's the big deal? It's all assembly under the hood.
Exactly. It's all ones and zeros. What does it matter?
right?
For now.
Yeah.
For now.
So I want to come back to talking about playbooks because you mentioned those and I got excited, but I think like an important thing to hang the playbook conversation on is talking about being an SRE at scale, because like being an SRE at a small company versus being an SRE at an enterprise, I think are quite possibly two completely different career fields. And so how did you address like the scale of applications you were dealing with?
That's a good question too. I think it really, so like talking about this like microservice system where a lot of people usually are at right now, typically everything is like a trade-off. And that's like a hand-wavy answer, but it's true. And so like when we go back to like the production readiness stuff, I think it's like helpful to understand like a process of like kind of rating these microservices. Like, is this like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? Like an auth system is probably going to be like a tier 1 system. Whereas if you have like a recommendations engine that's running things in the background, that's more of like a tier 3 system, because critical functionality still works. Checkout is going to be obviously a tier 1 system, something like that. But there's a lot of things to consider. Like I feel like especially like for people that are getting into this kind of role, it's important to understand like the traffic patterns. Like if you're working in like a small startup, like you're accountable to your customers, like maybe just during like business hours, like a banking application or something like that is not going to be as critical as an application that's used internationally, things like that. Those are like, does that kind of answer your question, like things to consider?
Yeah, for sure. And then tying that back to playbooks, like there's
Oh, yeah.
a certain level of scale where you just can't be familiar
Yes.
with all of these systems and you have to rely on playbooks. So what are some
Yeah.
of the strategies that you've seen to making sure that you have an accurate, up-to-date playbook when you need it?
Yeah. Up to date is key.
Everything is legacy as soon as you write it. Like as soon as you write something down, it is out of date. That code is already wrong as soon as it's released.
That, yeah. So that's, I'm gonna go back to like building out an SRE team is, you need technical skills, obviously, but you really need people who take ownership and care. Um, like we're talking about the playbooks, like I've definitely been at companies where I'm brand new, I'll get paged, I go to the playbook and I see that like the playbooks in Git, it hasn't been updated in 5 years. And I'm like, shoot, crap. Like, what do I do? Like, I'm getting paged. Usually, like when you're paged, it will point you to the playbook, and it's not there. So, the best way that I've seen people tackle this is like ownership. Someone needs to own these playbooks. Somebody, if a system is like a tier 1 or a tier 2 system, like this is part of this like production readiness checklist. Like before SRE is okay with deploying this. And like a lot of times, like company, like the SRE team they're not really the gatekeeper, because a lot of these companies, like the developers have the ability to ship themselves, but there are obviously consequences if they ship something and it crashes. And that doesn't completely that is like a shared ownership, but there needs to be ownership of these playbooks, and that's usually done by the SRE team. Typically, you will get, the leadership knows when something is very critical, and good leadership will make sure that these teams are communicating on like a regular cadence. I'm big on like these regular cadences, not necessarily because meetings kind of suck, but they are important for communication.
I like that you put the responsibility of the playbooks on the SRE team.
Yeah.
There's actually a debate that my CEO and myself have been talking about a bunch, where if it's an artifact that gets thrown over the wall, then it's not going, like it doesn't contain knowledge in a way. They're usually actionable things. And so since the knowledge isn't there, you won't know how to adapt to a playbook when you get to a new scenario that's not encountered before, right? And most of the problems that we find in systems that we automate are only problems that we haven't seen before.
And I will say too, so when I say like having accountability and ownership, like that's where, for better or worse, everybody hates on-call schedules, but those on-call schedules do serve as kind of like a back propagation of like if you're on an on-call rotation and you're getting paged frequently, like you have a vested interest in stopping that, because if it gets out of hand, it's just a huge snowball of, obviously, like you're starting to, like, your sleep is interrupted. So, and for better or worse, like people will be like, oh, you had a rough night, take it easy during the day. Yeah, right, that's not happening. Right. You're still getting up and doing your usual hours, but you're just like, I'm dead. So there's a vested interest in like sharing that ownership of the on-call rotation. And if you're getting paged constantly, like you're going to want to make sure that your teammates have the playbooks in place, and you're like, I just had a huge outage, and these are the steps that I took to remediate this. These are the things that were helpful. So after my on-call rotation, I'm going to go in and update the playbook and make sure that the steps that I took are there, so that maybe there's like more junior members on the team, they also know, and things like that. Because usually too, in like these kind of environments, like you'll have like multiple tiers there's a knock, but then even within SRE, like I think it's helpful to have like multiple tiers of SRE support. So you have like more senior level SREs and then more junior level SREs, and like maybe during the day you would page more junior SRE or something like that, whereas a senior is around to step in right away. But you want to have stuff in place for this.
Makes sense. What I'm hearing is you're a huge proponent of these incident management tools that are generating playbooks dynamically on the fly using some sort of LLM.
No, God, please. As long as someone's reviewing them, that's fine by me. But like, yeah, these LLMs are helpful, but they are not the end all. Like, that's not the end of the road.
You just gave me my next startup idea, Warren.
I mean, you'll have to compete with some of our past guests, I think, who are already promising dynamic run books based off. I mean, there's a thing that I think Sentry does, and I think there's a couple other tools now that they have your source code, or at least and then they have the stack trace from the error and the actual error message, and they use that to automatically propose a pull request into your Git repository that supposedly fixes the problem so that someone can review and approve it. And you got to know that at 3 a.m., you are just going to click approve. And
yeah, that's dangerous. All those tools, like I said, I think they're helpful, but they need to be used responsibly and with somebody who is actually like a human being with background that says yay or nay.
Yeah, I think we're still discovering like what the rules of responsibility are. Like, I feel like we're learning quickly, but we're still learning. Some of those being like, you have to give it very discrete tasks, ask it to do one thing so that the result that comes back to you is something you can actually parse in your head. And, don't give it something that you don't know how to do, because then you have no way to check its work. Or another one that I use that I really like is treat it like your own personal intern or junior developer. You wouldn't like hire an intern and then say, hey, go architect this 4-tiered microservice for us. It'll be due by Friday.
Oops. I mean, you're onto something there, Will. I will say that maybe it's just forcing us to finally think about concretely how humans should actually work together effectively. And what is the year 2025? We haven't figured out how to do that correctly. And now we're throwing in a tool into the mix, which actually requires us to do that work. I'm going to guess it's going to be like another 200 years before we've got that, actually figured out how to optimally communicate one human being to another.
I'm telling you, like I have a teenager, and like I would just like to point out that we have been peopling for millions of years, and we still do not have a good way to make the teenagers not really, really dumb. Okay, like just it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen.
Millions is a bit long. I'll give you like 400,000 or so, but I do definitely accept that argument that but acceleration of evolution. So maybe we'll get there faster this time.
Right, Moore's law for humans. That's a thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really appreciate Moore's law. What I don't appreciate is people saying that Moore's law applies to things that it doesn't apply to. I mean, I totally agree that the principle by what is it, correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. Although you look at lots of things and they do double at some rate. That's but people get Moore's law wrong a lot. They apply to things that don't make sense. It is literally just the size of the transistors will reduce by half every 18 months. That's it. That's the whole law. It doesn't apply like statistically to anything else. Now, we do see doubling and size reduction in other things, definitely like dies on a chip and etc. But there's like an interesting thing. Does it apply to these new plastic chips that it was China producing now that don't use silicon? I don't remember the material. And that are supposedly like half or a tenth of the size. Does Moore's law apply there too?
I have no idea. I was just trying to make a joke.
Okay, Forrest.
I wanted to backtrack just like a little bit and point out, Aimee, that I really like your kind of go-gettedness, I guess, with understanding actually what the business needs, because I work with a lot of people and especially students, and they just have no idea like what it is, like what is supposed to be the end result of this kind of like process that they're doing. And I think it's very important. I mean, it's important from like work, but I think it's also very important from a career perspective as well. Like, would you like to keep your job and maybe get new jobs? Like, you should understand what's going on at least a little bit.
Yeah, like I said, I don't know. I just like still to this day feel very fortunate to like be able to do something that I pretty much enjoy every single day. And I don't know. Maybe I was just like too harsh growing up or something, but I'm just like, I feel like if I'm getting a salary, then I should be. There is value in pushing back sometimes once you're like senior enough to have a level of expertise, like in a professional and respectful way. But yes, like at the end of the day, our job, whether we like it or not, is to make this company profitable, whether that be features, making sure that users have confidence in the service via SRE, stuff like that.
I thought you were going to say, despite leadership's strategy to the contrary. I am sort of curious if you have any personal strategies for gleaning better insight into how the business should work, or how a feature that is, say, technical transforms into value for the business. Are you working with product managers or with someone on the marketing and sales team? Are you grabbing information from the internet? Like, how are you actually figuring this out?
Like what is and isn't valuable for the business? I guess it for me personally over my career, it probably depends on the domain I'm working in. So I've worked in like domains of like the construction industry. Like I don't have expertise in what these people want. Obviously, my personality, I want to understand the domain that I'm working in so that I can try to better understand these types of things. But in that sort of scenario, like I am going to lean more like on the product people. Now, if it's like a dev focused company, my own thoughts, obviously like doing this a while, like having friends that I work with and like hearing their stories, that goes into like what isn't valuable. Like I'm trying to think of like different scenarios like that I've been in. There was definitely one later on in my career where there was like this is like an SRE type thing. So like the security team was extremely focused on like getting this tool out because they were getting paged based on things that were happening. But the tool that they had vetted, while it seemed good, it was a very like rush job to get it out in time. And so like on my side of things, like there was a lot of code that needed to be deployed to form the infrastructure. I'm being a little vague. So I'll try if I can clarify.
That's fair.
If I can clarify, I will. But at the end of the sorry,
it works. No, but it works because the more vague you are, the more trauma that listeners will have because it will relate to their situation. Like I have like 3 different traumas right now, just based off of what you said. Security teams pushing stuff out, not knowing what to do, not well vetted software that now everyone is dependent on. Like, not a short number of times.
Yeah, so like, and I have like in this particular scenario, like a really close relationship, like really got along well with the team that wanted to push this out. In the SRE side of things, I keep saying you have to understand like the tier one, tier two, tier three, and this was getting deployed to like tier one. So this is like getting deployed at the edge. So if this goes wrong, like there's no like the request doesn't go through. Like it doesn't even, it's not even like a latency issue. Like it's dead. um yeah, it's, I don't know, I see Lauren like shaking his head, so
No,
I'm
I was gonna say past trauma. Like actually, Will and I did an episode last year about how to handle scaling around the holidays because it's a time especially for companies that do e-commerce, et cetera, anything with orders. There is a huge spike and how to be prepared for that. And it's sort of interesting that if you break down the systems thinking model, you brought it up. There is this perverse incentive where if you have a deadline, that you are more likely to rush to meet that deadline, which means that you cut more corners, which means the thing is more risky. And so if you create a deadline or a code freeze to prevent risky code from getting into production, you are actually encouraging the exact thing that you are trying to prevent.
so, and like also on that end, and this is where like it, I guess it does, like you start to like traumatic events, and you, that is usually the case. I've also seen the case of we do a code freeze and a system doesn't get touched for 6 months, maybe even a year. And then you decide that you do want to deploy like a new feature, and boom, it's down, and hard down, because nobody has touched it in a year. And so like this certain situation that I ran into once, we had like a reindexing job, and there was so much data to reindex that what that the machines that it had been running on could no longer support the reindex process. So we're like screwed at this point. um, so yes, so you have to wait, and there's trade-offs in all regards. And as SRE, like it's just really your job to try to understand like not even like what's the perfect scenario, but like what's the least of like the evils here.
AWS actually is a really interesting guide for resilience engineering. And one of the things that they talk a lot about is what happens when there is like 1 or 2 points of failure, what actual new systems start coming into play, what does the request volume start to look like versus the nominal state.
Yeah.
And you mentioned caches at the edge. And I think one of the most common scenarios is, why do you add a cache? Well, because you're trying to reduce the load on your system, which means that you create the ability to create higher load on your system to hit the cache. And as soon as the cache, drops or gets busted because you're using something like Valkey, because no one's using Redis anymore, of course, which isn't designed to be persistent, it's going to drop at some point, which means you're going to get a lot of load to your system without going through the cache, and it's going to cause a hard failure at that point. And how are you going to recover? And so it sounds great to add a cache in, but then you're going to have to deal with this quite critical scenario where you are just, instead of being able to handle any number of requests, you're going to be able to handle nothing.
Yeah, back to like what you're saying, the distributed system stuff. Like in my mind, you brought up like single point of failure, and it's just like the nature of how things work. Like you're always going to have a single point of failure, and it's not so much like how do we get rid of the single point of failure, because I don't even think that's possible. Because you're gonna have like traffic management at some point. Like what if the traffic management fails? Um, it's more so in my mind like what system seems to be the most resilient, and that's where we want to place the single point of failure. So like usually it is like the distribution, like if you have like a cache distribution, that is usually the, in my opinion, like your wisest single point of failure.
That's an interesting way of phrasing it. I haven't heard that perspective before.
What's your on-call rotation look like?
So it's super different based on the company.
Yeah.
I am a big fan of companies who are hopefully you work at a company that's large enough that they have engineers across the globe, and so your on-call rotation can fall within the hours that allow you to work optimally and not be up all night. um, but like I said, I also firmly believe like everybody should share in that on-call rotation because it shares ownership. And if things start to go awry, then you have a vested interest in making things better. But the on-call rotation, like, it is what it is. And, it can be a little rough at the beginning, but it's a great way to learn, honestly, like just dive in, because there's nobody knows everything in the system. Like, you're going to hit something that probably somebody hasn't hit before.
When you say everyone, what's the size of the org that you're thinking about there?
I've been in teams where like my on-call rotation honestly was like every other week, which is a little rough. I've been on teams where it's, I want to say, like maybe once a month or something like that. And I feel like that's pretty reasonable. I think it's helpful to have, like I said, like the tiers of support. Also to like, hopefully it doesn't get to this point, but it's definitely a real thing I've seen, like with myself and others, where you're on an issue for 24, 40 hours straight, and you need to hand that off, because after a certain amount of time, like you're brain dead. Or like you need to bathe.
Right.
I mean, like, I guess, like if I think of like military or something, like you can go a long time without bathing, so maybe that's not the best example. Like more, you need sleep,
Especially in a remote workforce culture.
yeah, like you need sleep to be able to like debug things. But there should usually, I feel like, in a proper on-call rotation, like a handoff phase, if it's been like more than 24 hours, something like that.
Yeah, I think follow the sun implies that you hand it off to someone who's still awake at that time, and not you just stay awake until the sun comes up.
Right.
That in my experience, that typically works the best.
So this may be a little bit of a tangent, but since you're from the Jabber podcast, I have to ask you preference: Node.js, Deno, or Bun?
I'm old and boring, so I like Node still. No, I've talked to like the Dino team, and like I don't have anything against that. I'm old and boring, and
At least you didn't say IOJS.
yeah.
I still like Perl, so like I agree.
I think it's just fitting that she said I like Pearl and the rest of the audio cut out after that.
The sad part is it's still recording for her, so we'll find out when the episode released what she actually said.
It's only for this podcast, you guys, that I have so many technical problems. Like I'm fine in all of my other meetings. It's just this.
You're probably doing something right now.
I believe you, Jillian.
That's good.
I have no comment.
That's probably for the best.
Quite possibly.
How do you deal with the complexity of having to share so much knowledge with so many people? So the more people that are working in a solution and in an area and a team and an org means there's more things that are going to be created, which means there's more things everyone will have to be aware of to potentially deal with when an on-call incident comes up. Is there a good metric or litmus test to figure out what the maximum amount of stuff is that a team can actually manage?
Honestly, that is a very good question, and I feel like I don't have a good answer, but now that's something I want to go see if I can dig into more. But I also say like how we have like these different like tiers of support. It's hard if you get into like a more senior role, because stuff is going to bubble up to you. But it's usually helpful, like in a large team, there's usually even like SLAs to the developer team. So even like a lower environment is going to like be held accountable to the business to keep a lower environment up in a certain amount of time. Like sort of related to your question, like having those types of people like work in those environments, and that helps distribute knowledge of like how these different systems work without being tasked with like the actual production environment. And then if they do well in those lower environments, and then they can kind of move on to a production environment, and that helps spread the knowledge.
Pray. That's
Pray.
I think there's a corollary here where I often have to advise some companies on, which is we have like 5 different mobile apps because there's many different providers out there, and then there's a website and also web native version for your mobile app that isn't like an app version but is responsive. And then there's backend that goes with it, and the infrastructure. Is that all one team, so everyone is cross-functional and understand what's going on? Or do you have like 10 teams that each have the exact same functionality? And I feel like the answer keeps on being, well, they're both wrong, and there's no good solution there, and you just gotta have to deal with the consequences.
It's also, I mean, this is why I did startups for a long time. But as I've gotten like further into my career, I feel like it's hard to make an impact unless you've been at the company for a good amount of time, because the larger the code base and like the domain, then you really do need that time to understand it. Whereas like a startup's usually like a smaller application and you can understand it more, but like a lot of these like larger companies, they have like these huge systems and it takes time to understand it.
That's a really interesting challenge then. We see in the tech industry the average tenure for engineers reducing over time.
Yeah.
Does that mean that we're actually more and more incapable of building larger systems because people aren't staying at the company to be able to diagnose and build more resilient systems? Are we still attempting to do that and the systems we're building just aren't resilient anymore? Or is this just like you see whatever problems are close to you, and larger companies with bigger solutions are doing a good job at retaining experienced staff that have experience in their own solution in order to help solve those challenges?
It's very tricky because yeah, there's like a trade-off both ways. Like you stay at a company long enough, like yes, you might kind of have some like siloed information and start to not know how other people are solving problems, and then that kind of can produce like some blind spots in your knowledge. But at the same time, like if you don't stay at a place long enough, it can be hard to see like how this huge system interacts and be able to really solve like these harder problems, because it takes a while to like get the whole domain, the whole
Yeah.
system in your head. It's a there's definitely like like a vested interest, I feel like, in these companies and like retaining people.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's the benefits to them and not to the individual. And a lot of times, I mean, I guess maybe a different way of phrasing this is if we look at Dunbar's number, an org is going to be at max like 150 people. How many years of experience working in that company do we project a new hire would have to work before they are at the point where they're delivering or understanding the system sufficiently that 150 person org has created? Any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question too, like how it kind of like scales based on the size and the system and how long you'd have to be there. But
I have a personal preference, like, oh yeah, once I'm there, 6 months, I feel like I'm now somewhat accountable for every system, or a year or 2 years or something like that.
it probably, this doesn't answer your question, unfortunately, but I would say like one of the things that could be helpful is like if you start to like segment your career working in a similar domain, so some of that knowledge is transferable, like whether you're talking about like the hyperscaler that you're working on, or if you're more focused on like CDN distribution, like maybe that's valuable to other companies. Whereas like if it's a, if it's a paywalled type of application, then maybe your CDN experience is not as beneficial there.
I think also when you say 150 person org, you referring to like the entire company or just engineering?
I mean, even a subset of engineering potentially. Like I just look at Dunbar's number. Like your
Yeah.
teams are going to be like two pizza teams, for instance, that are cross-functional, but then there are different types of teams and different features within the product or product suite that you're delivering. And that can only get up to 150. Above that, you need to create a second org and have them work on a completely different feature set with a completely different focus. You think of like how in a hyperscaler, I'm going to use Google Workspace as an example, like email, or Gmail, and Drive, right? I can imagine those being separate, completely separate orgs, for instance. But I would not expect one org structure where it's fundamentally accountable for every single product in Google Workspace. There's just too much stuff there. So that's the part for me that makes the most sense. Like you can't have more than 150 people working on the same product because there's only so much functional work there. And at a larger size, you have a communication breakdown. You can't pass the information effectively. So that's just sort of the metrics on the math that seem to work out.
Too many cooks in the kitchen, and like I think for better or worse, some people have like a vested interest in like trying to offer value, but unfortunately sometimes the value is not there.
Yeah, I mean, even to your point of like, well, let's have an on-call rotation that everyone and say the team and the org could participate in, right? 150 people means you're on call for your product once every 3 years. So, right. So that doesn't work out, right? So, if your org is 50 people, then you get to the, okay, once a year I'm on a call. Well, that maybe works out potentially if you have a low number of bugs, you deal with real-time applications that can never really be down, highly resilient, and you're probably running fire drills during working hours as if there were an incident to know how to respond and not just hopefully waiting and never seeing a problem.
I kind of feel like computer systems mirror a lot of real life. So whether it be people who don't understand SRE, they're kind of like, what in the world do you do? I'm like, I'm basically like an emergency room doctor. And somebody comes into the emergency room, and my responsibility is keep them alive until the right person can come in and get them into critical condition.
Not even the surgeon, but high level. I understand how patients work and the sets of problems that can happen, and I can direct people in the right places.
Yeah.
The wet stuff on the inside and the dry stuff on the outside.
I love it.
You said nuclear physics. Well, I don't think you said EMT, right?
Right. Yeah. True. But I do spend, not that this qualifies my opinion by any means, but I do spend a lot of time out in the wilderness, and the wilderness first aid stuff I've been exposed to is pretty much that. Keep the wet stuff on the inside, dry stuff on the outside.
Okay, so now I'm imagining Bear Grylls. I don't. Outbacker, frequently known on the internet means for drinking his own urine unnecessarily.
But the likes he got, that's the metric.
You got to wonder what he was really going for. Was he going for, teaching survival skills, or was it, just to become a paid influencer?
I'm pretty sure he's got a mortgage to pay. So, someone who's interested in pursuing a career in SRE, give us your top rundown, pros and cons, and things you wished you had known before ending up here.
There's a lot of different paths that you can take into SRE. One thing I didn't really touch on, and I know we're close on time, so I won't go into it too much, is a performance engineer. That's very important for an SRE team to do performance testing of these kinds of things. That's a huge part of SRE is resource allocation, and you need performance testing in place to better make those decisions. So performance engineering, I can say from my background, coming in from application engineering, there's a lot of value there because you understand how these microservice systems work together, and then the systems engineer background has an ability to debug at the network level really well, and things like that, and all of those things come in and offer value to an SRE team. I guess things I wish I would have known, kind of we talked about at the beginning of the episode, I'm very much go, go, go. And early in my career, everybody was you're gonna burn out, slow down. And I was impossible. And I still say I didn't burn out, because I still absolutely love it. But I really did not realize that it actually did start to the lack of sleep just did start to kind of take a toll on my actual health a little bit. So lesson learned to myself is be cognizant of your personality and your what some of your weaknesses might be there, because for me, I absolutely love what I do, and I want to be able to do this for a very long time. So I kind of came to this realization that I was whoa, if you don't put, and management, my manager was fine. He would encourage me to do more of it. And not my director, right. Same thing. Dude, you need to take some time off. So my advice would be if you're more on that side of the spectrum, know yourself and allow yourself that time, because it will make you better in the long run. Other things, I would just say if it sounds interesting to you, don't shy away from it, because it is, I feel a huge there's like a huge surface of areas you can tackle. But if I'm always like of the mindset like anybody can learn anything. Obviously, like some people are like more technically talented, they come in with more experience, those sorts of things. But if it's interesting to you, like, and you have the drive, like, go for it. Those would be my biggest like two takeaways.
And through the power of LLMs, now you two, everyone, can be an expert in whatever topic you fancy. I mean, listening to you talk, Aimee, about this really makes me think, like you say, you really have to care a lot, but caring a lot means understanding the business and gives you an edge over everyone else who may not care as much. They won't give them a drive to really dive in and be able to make the right decision. But then there's the question that comes up of like, if you care too much, you're liable to burn out from doing that.
Yeah.
And you really need to know yourself. And that's a tall order, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, like it was a challenge for me to be like, you can't be the hero 24/7, or like you're not going to be able to like sustain this.
But there's just one more fire over there that you know how to deal with.
Oh Lord, yeah. I mean, I guess I would say too, like I'm probably at a place now where the thing that I did really enjoy is like I did get to serve in more of like a engineering manager role on the SRE team towards the end of my last role. And um, everybody is like driven by different things, but you can kind of see people in the org that have a lot of potential, and starting to kind of like mentor them and hand things off to them and things like that can be very rewarding, and is really like the best thing you can do is, it sounds like so hand wavy, but like force multiplier, like, whether you're an actual manager or in a senior role or anything like that, like what can you do to help the company and the teammates like fall into the pit of success?
I like that analogy.
Important leadership skill, learn to delegate, right?
You have to be okay at a certain point in your career with like not being the hero, because if you're in that kind of role, like sometimes your value is more so in enabling others and building out parts of the system that like help others fall into the pit of success. And if you kind of like are one of those people that feels like they always need like the like recognition, like then like leadership type roles might not be the path for you, because a lot of the recognition is going to be like hidden behind the scenes of enabling others.
Yeah, very true.
But it's warm fuzzy, like the girl in me likes it. So
I agree with you, but it's a completely different high. Probably not the best analogy in the world, but that's the one that just sticks in my head.
It's more so like I guess I would almost equate it to like delayed gratification. Like you're not gonna get the like that a girl in the moment, but it might come like 2 years later when somebody that you manage comes back to you and be like, man, like you taught me this thing and I used it today and thank you. And you're like, wow, that really feels good.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that though, because that actually means that some of the most enjoyment you get out of it, if that's the right word, is actually seeing others execute effectively and seeing back on what you've taught them, which indirectly has no impact on the business in a way, especially if they leave and go somewhere else. So, there is this weird paradox there.
Yeah. It's a little of both. Yeah, for sure. It's helping the business, and hopefully you help other people on the team that help the business, or just go on and do good things themselves.
I don't know if this is relevant, but this keeps coming to my mind in this conversation. There's this SMBC Saturday morning breakfast cereal webcomic issue where Superman's like, how can I deliver the most value possible? And the mayor of the city is like, well, you know what? Actually saving people, like you're pretty slow at that if we look at it. What would really work is if we just had more energy to make this, relevant for 2025, to obviously power all of those LLMs to help people. And so can you just turn this one giant crank really fast as you can? That's just your whole life, just there. And like decades later, he's still turning the crank. And like, that's not a very rewarding experience, but that's what gives the most value to civilization. Yeah. And one day, the years later, the mayor wakes up and says, you know what, actually, we don't need you anymore. We automated your job away with nuclear fusion. And now we generate unlimited energy all the time, basically, without doing anything. You can just retire.
Hopefully that doesn't happen. You're always having to invent new ways to make yourself valuable. That's part of being in tech.
I don't see us running out anytime soon, which is good because
No,
I've got a mortgage to cover, so
not
I'm
with
cool with
AI coming.
that.
See, I don't know. I just have the dissenting opinion here. I feel like there is just people making the same mistakes.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, same underlying mistakes. Yes, it's history repeating itself. Yes.
So Warren, if you could just compile a list of those.
I tried. So I have tried to write down. So what happens frequently, I always thought I'd be doing engineering, but what I do is I write blog posts and I record podcast episodes. And I get triggered sometimes while I'm doing other things in my life, talking with my colleagues and whatnot in the communities that I'm in, so much so that I feel compelled to have to write something. And so there is a list of things out there of problems that I've seen and my recommendations for it. But some of them are like really nuanced thing, like this one particular little thing in security that everyone seems to run into. And then there's like a 40-minute conference talk on it or a blog post on it that I'm sure no one has ever read.
Well, it sounds like a really good point. Put all those words together into one coherent sentence.
In the right order.
Right? That sounds like a really good time to move on picks, and maybe you can point someone to some of those resources.
I'm not going to plug my blog as my pick, but I'm happy to put a link for this episode for anyone that wants it. Actually, I'll find the Saturday morning breakfast cereal episode too and put that. But my pick actually is going to be based off our conversation. There's a book by Peter Senge called The Fifth Discipline, and it's all about systems thinking. And there's this one great example in the book about it's a canonical thing that I believe is taught at I think it's Harvard Business School, but also at MIT in the economics theory. And that's basically there is a brewery that makes a beer, and they make enough for a distributor to sell the beer to retailers for people to buy it. And every retailer sells, like your local store sells 2 cases every week. And then in some random week, a new pop song comes out and everyone loves the beer, and because the band mentions the beer in the song. And from that point on, every single retailer just increases the number of beers, cases that they sell by 1 to 3. And this causes some ridiculous effects to happen throughout the whole ecosystem. The distributors will fall over, the brewery will get some massive orders, and basically what ends up happening is lots of people will be fired for failing to deliver effectively. And it's just such a small change to happen, and you can see huge impacts. And I feel like it's a really interesting case study of what happens over and over again in lots of organizations, and relates out to a lot what Aimee was talking about in today's episode. So I thought it was relevant.
That's pretty cool. That's called The Fifth Dimension?
Discipline.
Fifth Discipline. Gotcha.
By Peter Senge, yeah.
Right on. Jillian, what about you? What'd you bring for a pick?
I don't know. I'm giving a talk next week on HPC, and now it occurs to me that I don't know if that's going to be like recorded and put anyplace, so that's maybe not my pick. I don't know, like Horizon Zero Dawn, that's the video game I've been playing. And maybe the talk too, if it's actually published and recorded. We'll see.
You can always record it yourself on your laptop, and then you'll have the transcript, and you can publish the slides, and then you can, release it to all your faithful audience there.
Yeah.
That's true. I mean, I could just have somebody record it on my phone, right? Like, I don't know.
Okay. So we're going to count on seeing your talk then.
Yeah, sure. That's the point. It's supposed to be self-promotion. Like,
right? Right.
That is what I do.
Aimee, I know you've done this before. What do you have for a pick this week?
Let's see. I was debating if I should pick something technical or non-technical. I guess I will try to break it up a little bit. I'm going to pick a band that I am like absolutely obsessed with, and I can't shut up about it. And because other people won't listen to me anymore about it, this is a great opportunity to share it. My husband is really tired of me talking about them and blasting them. So, and that is Sleep Token. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of it or heard of them, but I will drop a link. I first heard about them maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and they have a bunch of new songs out this year, and it's when I've had a long stressful day at work, I don't know why, I listen to them and it's peaceful to me to fall asleep to, so whatever. Maybe other people will like it too.
What's the genre?
That's the thing. So they are like they're all over the place. Like I guess traditionally more like metal. But they're almost like a little bit like EDM, a little bit metal, like honestly like a tiny bit hip hop sometimes. Like they're just like you listen to your song and you're like, "Oh, this is like really relaxing." And then they start screaming and then they're and then it's like back to like a hip hop kind of vibe and I'm just like, "What's happening?"
I,
Um
I mean, it's just like you're gonna say, like, yeah, it's like Haydn or Dominic the Christmas Donkey. I just use that music to fall asleep at night. I'm just like, really, like, not my personal choice, but if it works for you, that's pretty interesting. I like metal, so maybe I'll check it
don't know
out.
why I absolutely love them. So yeah, that's gonna be my pick.
That's awesome. I was just, as you were saying it, you're like, oh, it's just what I want to listen to after a long, stressful day. I was like, oh, this would be so great if it's a metal band. And then you're like, ah, surprise, guess what?
I mean, they're not metal in the sense of like I really like this band Motionless in White. If people have heard of them, they're not metal in that sense. They're like a little more chill than that. But yeah,
Right on.
I'll
Cool.
drop a link before we hang up.
Cool, cool. All right. So my pick, I switched it since we started recording because it's now a relevant topic. On Netflix, there is a series called the Bear Grylls Celebrity Hunt. And so it's all of these celebrities who are taken to Costa Rica and then they compete, and the losers of the competition have to go into this area that's like walled off, and they have to survive in there for 1 hour while Bear Grylls is hunting them. So they have an hour to either escape the bear pit or get caught by Bear Grylls. And it was actually just super fun to watch. And I brought it up at work saying, hey, for our next offsite, we should go to the bear pit and have Bear Grylls hunt us down.
Where Bear Grylls will actually be Will Button.
I'd be cool with that, yeah.
I feel like that may create some sort of psychological safety issues for coming back to work later.
Yeah, there's probably a downside to that, but let's not focus on that.
Makes me think my husband like at first I thought I was like, what are you watching? But he watches this it's probably like a famous YouTuber. People probably know. I can't think of him, but like he's always out in the wilderness like doing things. And my husband loves watching him. And initially I was like, this is crazy, but now I kind of like it too.
Right?
He's usually in Alaska. I
There have been a lot of those episodes where my kids were watching something. I'm like, that's stupid. Why are you watching, wasting your time on that? And like 2 hours later, I'm still sitting next to him watching it. But anyway, Aimee, thanks for being on the show. This was a fun chat. Thank you for your insights and your expertise and sharing your thoughts on SRE. Warren, Jillian, thank you both for jumping in and co-hosting today. It's good to see you both. And for all our listeners, thanks for listening. We'll see you.